Hi everyone, this is Pavani. On our channel Bharat Rising, I am here to proudly present the historian Dr. KOENRAAD ELST. Dr. ELST is born a Dutch Catholic but grew up into Hindutva ideologist. Dr. ELST studied Indian history, literature, culture and philosophy at greater depth. His master's degree was in Indology, followed by doctorate in Hindu nationalism and revivalism. Ever since his field work at Banaras Hindu University, Dr. ELST has been a regular visitor of India for over 40 years now. Dr. ELST is an author of 30 books, including the #1 non-fiction bestseller in 2001, Decolonizing the Hindu Mindset. Dr. ELST is one of the few Westerners who actively defends Hinduism. He is well known for his blunt and objective view. Today, I am going to ask him few interesting and much relevant questions that will express his critical and analytical thoughts on Hinduism and the Hindu movement. When the literature and the wisdom is gone, and when someone from the West, they come and they say, okay, you are not civilized enough. You don't know how to do this. You don't know how to rule yourself. You need us to rule you properly.
But there is then a difference between the Islamic colonization and the British colonization.
If an Indian comes across another Indian so fluent in English, we are so impressed.
Sanskrit had a real chance of really replacing English, becoming the medium of the courts, of the parliament and of instruction.
When did this happen?
Whereas Hindi, well, in 48, 49.
Oh, soon after the independence.
Yes.
English is your fifth language.
English is my
But that
fifth
didn't
language.
stop you from writing books in English.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely no excuse not to produce engineering textbooks in Telugu or in,
Tamil or our regional languages.
Yes.
I don't think there is any Hindu movement actually which focuses on the language, especially Sanskrit. Let's talk about your book, which is the #1 non-fiction bestseller, Decolonizing the Hindu Mind. Colonization and the invaders, they destroyed not only India's history and literature, but also the wealth and wisdom. Like if you see Nalanda University, after multiple invasions, they completely burnt it down and so many thousands of books are burnt with no trace of wisdom, whatever the ancestors had. Not only the wealth, but also our mindset is also, our souls are also damaged. But you are advising us not look at everything through the lens of colonization. But how can we do that? How can we get that confidence and how can we forget the past?
Okay, well, let's start with this apparent phenomenon of an inferiority complex. Let's start at the beginning. You see, the first colonization was the Islamic colonization, long before the British.
Yes.
As you know, when Modi was freshly in power, then the foreign press reported with indignation that he had been talking about 1200 years of colonization. And so they were, angry that he apparently treated Islamic rule as a form of colonization.
But isn't that right?
Well, first of all, you see, there was a whole discussion about these 1200 years. Of course, different areas in India were affected sooner or later. So this 1200 is a bit of an approximation. But at any rate, the point is that he said that colonization started before the British or even the Portuguese arrived. And that is very true. For instance, if a Britisher thought of making his fortune by coming to India, he had to first, in England, take a course of Hindustani, of some sort of Hindi, Urdu, at any rate, good enough to communicate with the local people in a very large part of India, and take exams and prove that he could do that before he started on his journey to India. By contrast, you see, the Islamic rulers never bothered to learn an Indian language. You see, their court language until the 19th century was Persian. And they didn't care, and so the natives adapted somewhat. They took over Persian writing, they took over many Persian loanwords, technical terms especially, But so the colonizers themselves didn't care. So in a way, you see, they were more colonizers than the British were. Then, in the very first wave of Islamic colonization, you have a very interesting character. In fact, the first Indologist, the first foreigner who studied Indian culture, namely Al-Biruni. Now, Al-Biruni observes, and so he gets to know the Indian people quite well. You see, he learns the vernacular, he learns Sanskrit, he reads all the Sanskrit literature. He even makes an Arabic translation of the Yoga Sutra, Kitab Patanjali, the book of Patanjali. So you see, he knows Indian culture quite well. Nevertheless, it is he who remarks, "Oh, Indians are so full of themselves. They think that there is no country like theirs, no culture like theirs. If you tell them about some great scholar in Tehran or in Bukhara or so, they don't believe you. They think only India has scholars." Okay, so at that time, you see, Indians were on top of the world. They thought themselves very superior. And indeed, you see, their neighbors, the Arabs, for example, looked up to them.
Yeah. So,
So it was a bit of the situation like Americans in the 20th century. If you asked Americans what they thought about India, they couldn't find India on the map. They didn't know that there existed something like the rest of the world. They were completely full of themselves, very self-centered and so on. So you see, at an earlier stage, India was in the same position. And so that changed with being, under the thumb of foreign conquerors for long enough. So yes, but there is then a difference between the Islamic colonization and the British colonization. It is that with the Islamic world, the Hindus have very little to do. The Muslims don't try to influence the Hindus. You see, they do some fighting, or they do some exploitation. You see, they extract heavy taxes from the Hindus. Then Hindus, end up being their employees and so on. So there is a certain material relation, but culturally, Islam has little influence. Like, for instance, you mentioned Nalanda University. You see, what the British did with Hindu, institutes of learning is to influence them, to infuse, modern British ideas into Hindu thinking. What the Muslims do is to burn the place down.
Yeah, exactly. There is a difference.
Yeah. So, that's, I noticed first, this difference in the whole discussion about the Ayodhya temple. You see, in the 90s, of course, everybody was reprimanding the BJP for being anti-Muslim and so on. Apparently, they hadn't noticed that the BJP was absolutely doing its best not to offend the Muslims. That they were trying to package it as Muslim-friendly as possible. So, for example, they were talking about, yes, and the Rama temple, is for the Indian deity Rama. They didn't say Hindu, they said Indian. And Babar, they didn't say he was an Islamic invader. No, the foreign invader Babar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so they absolutely avoided bringing Islam into the picture. Yeah. And, so I noticed that, well, if Babar destroyed temples, it was not because he was foreign. I mean, look at earlier foreign invaders. You see, the Greeks invaded, and what did they do? You see, one of the Greek kings, Menander, better known in India as Milinda, you see, he became a Buddhist. He had these big philosophical discussions, which you find written down in the Milinda Panya, the questions of Menander. It's a Buddhist classic. You have Heliodorus, who worships Krishna, and so on.
What about Alexander?
You have the Greeks in Bactria who contribute, the Buddha statue is their invention with his, the Buddha with curly hair, which Indians don't have. It's typically Mediterranean. And so it's modeled on the Apollo statue. And so, there are very important contributions by the Greeks to native Indian culture. Then you get the Huns invading. You see some of the Hun kings become Shaivas. And the Kushanas become another brand of Buddhists and so on. So they very much participate in Indian culture. The English, of course, don't convert to anything, but nevertheless, they discover Harappa. They decipher the Brahmi script. They discover the classics like the Chanakya, the Arthashastra. and so on. So in all kinds of ways, they contribute to Hindu culture. And they never destroyed temples. You see, they destroyed the Indian industrial system. And I'm not going to say that they were all benign to India. Nevertheless, they did not destroy temples. And so that is a typically Islamic thing, partly also Christian. I mean, if I say something critical of Hindus on Twitter, there are always, chauvinist hotheads who say, yeah, foreigner, what do you understand? You're a foreigner. Well, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, but my question is just that why do we need to downplay colonization? I mean, I agree with you. Islamic colonization is different from British colonization.
Okay.
But still, I'm not talking about no difference. I'm just talking about the effects of colonization on our mindset.
Yes.
So now.
Okay. Now here I have gone through a certain evolution. So of course, if you having written a book of that title, I do very much recognize the factor. Being colonized and the need to get out of that mindset. On the other hand, you see, I've noticed since then, and so you got the whole wave of wokeism and so on, where the word decolonizing became very voguish. And so I noticed that, you see, people are making too much of it. You create an impression that certain things that you might call colonized and that you need to get rid of, like most obviously the use of the English language in India. You see that they are being done because some colonial power is imposing it on you. Now that's not the case. You see, you have Macaulay, but that's 200 years ago. And after 1947, okay, let's now for a moment, concentrate on that one example. You see the use of the English language. The generation of freedom fighters, they were totally clear in their mind that decolonization means discontinuing the colonial language. So you see, in some African countries, they've decided to continue the colonial language. So you still today, 50 years after decolonization, you still have English-speaking, French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking African countries. And you see often all the mathematics textbooks in school and so on, they are simply donated by the mother country. And so, they don't care to practically, in the history books, they may still say, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors, the Celtic people, and so on, like they do in France. So they don't care too precisely, but so for purposes of education, okay, let's donate these textbooks and they can do like that. And so it would be much better if African people themselves wrote their own textbooks in their own language and so on. There you have practical problems of language standardization and so on. The fact that the languages are very small, so it's commercially not very interesting to write, to pay writers for those textbooks, then to publish them and so on. So you see, I am not going to condemn the African policies of maintaining the colonial language. It's for them to find out. And so there you can justify it with some practical circumstances that obtain in Africa, but that very visibly don't obtain in India. In India, you have very large language territories with a long literary history, and so there's absolutely no excuse not to produce engineering textbooks in Telugu or in
Tamil or other regional languages.
Yes.
So you are saying that English is not at all required. I mean,
there is no need for English
as a third language.
You can learn it as a foreign language, like I have done. English is my fifth language.
English is your fifth language.
English is my
but that didn't stop you from writing books in English.
Yes, exactly. And so you see, given the natural intelligence of the Indian people, I'm very sure that very many people there are quite capable of communicating with their Australian colleagues in English while having done their original inventions and so on in Tamil or in Bengali or whatever. So you see, English is, or whichever is the dominant international language, that should be learned, but nevertheless that should not be the medium of instruction.
Yeah, understood. I totally agree here, because even today, like if an Indian comes across another Indian so fluent in English, we are so impressed, So that itself talks about our mindset, the kind of admiration we have for English. So yes, definitely there we need to decolonize. Our mindset needs to decolonize.
And so for to continue the example of language, Well, it's not the British or any other English-speaking foreigner who imposes English on you. That's an Indian elite that does this.
Exactly.
And so the generation of the freedom struggle was very clear in their minds that English had to be discontinued. So there was a vote taken in the language committee of the Constituent Assembly, and there were two candidates, so should Hindi, Sanskritized Hindi, and Sanskrit. And so very, very, very narrowly it was Hindi that won, which I think is a black day for India, because Sanskrit had a real chance of really replacing English, becoming the medium of the courts, of the parliament, and of instruction.
When did this happen?
Whereas Hindi, well, in 48, 49.
Oh, soon after the independence.
Yes, whereas Hindi had immediately a lot of bona fide opponents. And so especially in Tamil Nadu, also in Bengal and so on, people looked down on Hindi. They thought, you see, Hindi was a conglomerate of dialects, there was not really any proper Hindi. And anyway, it's not as nice and as literarily rich as Bengali, for example. And even many Hindi speakers look down on Hindi. At the time when I wrote that book, I didn't even know that yet. But so many Hindi-speaking people think that, you see, my language is Awadhi, my language is Bhojpuri, and so on. And so for them, Hindi is some kind of Esperanto, you see, some common denominator between all the different North Indian languages. Sanskrit had a real chance. You see, Sanskrit had prestige. Even Ambedkar, accepted Sanskrit as the national language. Today's Ambedkarites never would do that.
Yeah.
But Ambedkar did. There were some Muslim leaders who accepted Sanskrit. So at that time, Sanskrit really had a very good chance. Also, because those in the Muslim and the Christian community who feared that, you see, Sanskrit would have a Hinduizing influence, were too much on the defensive in the circumstances. You see, the Muslims had the guilt for partition on them. The Christians, this is not sufficiently realized, the Christians are very much on the defensive because this was the time of decolonization. Now, what happened? You see, in many decolonizing countries, the missionaries bore the brunt. Like when in 1960, Belgian Congo was decolonized, there were, big massacres of Christian missionaries. And so this could happen in India too. And in fact, it was happening on a very large scale and very brutally in China. The Christian missionaries in India knew very well that this could happen in India too. So you see, they were in no mood at that time to make a fuss. So you see, if Hindus had pushed through Sanskrit, there would have been no opposition. And so even for Tamils and so on, there is less to be said against Sanskrit than against Hindi. So you see, Sanskrit could have taken over its natural role of the language of learning and so on. People could perfectly continue their local languages, but for the purpose of something really serious, they would use Sanskrit. And they would use it in all of India, and in 1 or 2 generations, everybody would be familiar with it. So that really had a good chance, which Hindi did not have. Nevertheless, initially it looked like, and as it was laid down in the Constitution, that by 1965, English would be phased out in favor of the language chosen by the Constituent Assembly, which happened to be Hindi. Now, then the Nehruvian elite sabotaged this.
Oh, Nehru.
And so they used the misgivings in Tamil Nadu especially to create a semblance of popular opposition. But in fact, the popular opposition had nothing to do with it. It is the elite that wanted to continue English. And so that's what happened through a presidential decree. So that's very easy to overrule. You see, if this government, this supposedly nationalist government, is not overruling it, is not saying, no, you see, we're going to stop English, then it is because they don't want to. It's not because there are constitutional objections and so on. On the contrary, what they would do if they declared Hindi the national language is simply to implement what has been laid down in the Constitution. So that would be a really strong decolonizing statement.
So you're trying to say that language is one area where we need to come out of seeing that only English as the main language. So what else?